In 1752, Britain's Murder Act codified a horror beyond the gallows. Executed murderers would be publicly dissected, their bodies transformed into anatomical lessons before paying crowds. This wasn't mercy. It was the final erasure of personhood, where death became entertainment and flesh became curriculum. What follows is the story of Silas Blackwell, carpenter and condemned murderer, who discovered that execution was merely the opening act of his humiliation. If stories like this one, drawn from the darkest corners of medical history, compel you to confront what we've forgotten, consider supporting this channel. Your subscription ensures these voices, silenced by scalpel and scandal, continue to echo. But here's what they don't tell you about attending your own funeral. You might be conscious for it. The marble was cold against my back, colder than I'd imagined death would be. November afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of Surgeons' Hall, illuminating dust motes that drifted like ash. I could see them. Shouldn't I be beyond seeing? The noose had done its work 4 hours prior at Tyburn, the crowd of 5,000 watching as I strangled for what felt like eternity. My neck hadn't broken cleanly. Never does for the poor. We can't even afford a proper drop. But now, lying naked on the slab in the dissection theater, I wondered if the true punishment was just beginning. Tiered seating rose around me in a semicircle, every bench packed with students clutching notebooks, wealthy spectators fanning themselves against the theater's warmth, and artists positioning their easels. They'd paid good coin for this, some as much as 5 shillings to watch a man unmade. I was the afternoon's entertainment, more theatrical than Drury Lane, more visceral than any tragedy on stage. Dr. William Cheselden circled my body like a buyer examining livestock. At 58, he was London's most celebrated anatomist, author of the landmark Osteographia, pioneer of surgical techniques that had saved hundreds. His white wig was immaculate, gold spectacles perched on his nose, leather apron already tied over his waistcoat. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd done this 100 times. Because he had. The Murder Act of 1752 had been in effect mere months, but Cheselden had dissected criminals for decades before it became legal mandate. "Gentlemen and ladies," he nodded toward a cluster of well-dressed women in the front row. "Before you lies Silas Edward Blackwell, aged 34, hanged this morning at Tyburn for the murder of Thomas Harrow, merchant. A fresh specimen, ideal for our purposes. You'll note the body is still in rigor mortis, the muscles contracted, joints stiff. This will pass within 24 hours, but for now, it provides excellent demonstration of muscular structure." Fresh specimen. I had a name. Had. Past tense already, 4 hours dead. My last morning had begun in Newgate's condemned cell, that stone box measuring 8 feet by 6 where light entered only through a grated slot near the ceiling. I'd woken to the sheriff reading my sentence for the final time. "Hanged by the neck until you are dead, and thereafter your body shall be dissected and anatomized according to the act for better preventing the horrid crime of murder." The words dissected and anatomized had haunted me more than hanged by the neck. Hanging was a moment. Dissection was forever. I'd refused breakfast. Bread and beer I couldn't swallow past the tightness in my throat. The prison chaplain, Reverend Finch, had visited, his face bearing the weariness of a man who'd offered last rites to hundreds. "Make peace with God, my son," he'd said, his voice automatic. "Confess, repent." "I don't regret killing him," I told him honestly. "Does that damn me?" He had paused, truly looking at me for the first time. "Yes, but perhaps a just damnation." Then, softer. "I'm not supposed to say that, but I've seen what men like Harrow do. Pray anyway, Silas. You'll need it." I hadn't prayed. Instead, I'd thought of Anne, my sister, 19 years old and broken by Thomas Harrow's violence. June 1752, he'd cornered her in his townhouse pantry where she worked as housemaid, raped her while his wife entertained guests 2 rooms away. When Anne tried to report it, the housekeeper dismissed her without wages, called her a lying slut seeking attention. She tried to kill herself in September, laudanum overdose, and I'd found her barely breathing in our rented room in Southwark. That's when I'd gone to Harrow. September 14th, evening, entering through the servants' entrance I'd repaired months earlier when he'd hired me for carpentry work. I'd confronted him in his study. "You raped my sister. You'll answer for it." He'd laughed, actually laughed, whiskey glass in hand, firelight dancing on his embroidered waistcoat. "Your sister? The blonde mouse? Boy, servants exist for our use. She should feel honored I noticed her. Now get out before I have you transported to the colonies." The hammer was in my hand. I'd been carrying my tools, planning to demand payment for the repair work he'd never compensated me for. 7 blows. I remember each one, the sound of his skull cracking, the way he'd stopped laughing after the second strike, the blood pooling on his imported Persian rug, soaking into fibers that cost more than I'd earned in 5 years. They'd arrested me the next morning. Anne testified at my trial, shaking and weeping, barely audible. The judge dismissed her as hysterical, an unreliable witness whose testimony held no weight against Harrow's spotless reputation. His widow sobbed in the gallery, 4 children crying beside her. The jury deliberated 30 minutes. Guilty. Death by hanging, body to be dissected. The sentence terrified me more than I'd admitted. Not the hanging. That was just pain, then nothing. But the dissection. The thought of strangers cutting me open, students taking notes on my organs, my body parts sold or preserved or mounted as specimens, never buried, never whole, never at rest. At Tyburn, they'd let me speak final words. 5,000 faces blurred before me, some jeering, most simply curious. "I killed Thomas Harrow," I'd said, voice carrying across the crowd. "I admit it. He deserved it for what he did to my sister. I regret nothing, except that I'll be denied a proper grave. When they cut me open tomorrow, know this, I was a man, not a specimen." Then the cart pulled away beneath my feet. The rope caught, tightened. My neck didn't snap. The drop wasn't far enough. The executioner lazy or incompetent. Instead, I strangled, thrashing, lungs screaming for air that wouldn't come. 4 minutes, someone told me later. 4 minutes of choking, vision darkening, consciousness fragmenting. The last thing I saw clearly was Anne's face in the crowd, hand pressed to her mouth, sobbing. The darkness should have been final, should have been peace. But now I was here, in Surgeon's Hall, somehow aware of every moment. Was this hell? An afterlife consciousness trapped in cooling flesh? Or had my dying brain, oxygen-starved at Tyburn, imagined all this in those final seconds, a nightmare that felt like eternity but lasted only moments? It didn't matter. Real or imagined, I experienced it as real. The marbles cold pressed against my shoulders, buttocks, heels. The theater's warmth, body heat from 200 spectators, created currents of air that raised goosebumps on my exposed skin. I could smell carbolic acid, the sharp antiseptic Cheseldon used to clean his instruments, though germ theory wouldn't exist for another century. Mingled with it, sweat, perfume from the ladies, tobacco smoke from pipes lit in the back rows. Cheseldon selected his primary scalpel from an array of gleaming instruments laid out on a side table, surgical steel, recently sharpened, blade catching the afternoon light. He positioned himself at my chest, one hand pressing my sternum as if I might rise. Might protest, might reclaim my flesh from his authority. "The primary incision," he announced to his audience, "begins at the sternal notch, here, at the base of the throat, and continues downward to the pubic symphysis. From there, we branch to each shoulder, creating what we call the Y-incision. This exposes the thoracic and abdominal cavities while preserving structural integrity for skeletal articulation." He placed the blade against my throat. I felt it. Not pain, but awareness, a pressure, a presence, a violation. The boundary between self and world, maintained by skin for 34 years, was about to dissolve. Everything I'd kept private, my lungs that had breathed air since 1718, My heart that had first fluttered when I'd kissed Margaret Porter behind the mill at 17. My intestines that had digested my last meal of bread I barely tasted. All would be exposed, made public, made academic. The blade drew downward, parting skin and subcutaneous fat. I felt my body opening, the sensation like being unzipped, unmade, deconstructed. Blood welled, but didn't flow. Dead hearts don't pump. The theater leaned forward as one organism, breath held, 200 people watching my interior revealed. A young medical student in the second row, couldn't have been older than 22, earnest face, careful notes, whispered to his companion, "He was a person this morning." His friend replied, "He's a lesson now." And that's when I understood the true horror wasn't the dissection itself. It was how quickly person became object, how seamlessly identity dissolved into anatomy, how efficiently my name, Silas, became the subject, the specimen, this example. 4 hours from execution to education, 4 hours from man to meat. Cheselden continued cutting, the scalpel's path steady and sure. When he reached my groin, he branched the incision upward to each shoulder, creating the Y. Then, with practiced efficiency, he began peeling back skin and muscle, exposing my rib cage like opening shutters on a window. "Note the pectoralis major," he lectured, pointing with a probe. "Exceptionally developed, manual labor, certainly. This man worked with his hands his entire life. Carpentry, I believe the records indicated. See how the muscle fibers attach at the humerus? Repeated motion over decades created this density." I learned carpentry from my father. Age 9, he put a chisel in my hand. "Measure twice, cut once, son." I'd built Anne's bed when she was 7, carved her name into the headboard. That bed still sits in our room in Southwark. She'll sleep in it tonight, alone, knowing I'm here, being unmade. Asterisk. Cheselden gripped my rib cage with both hands, fingers curling around bone still slick with tissue. He'd need the bone saw next, a brutal instrument, 14 inches of serrated steel designed to slice through calcium and marrow. A young assistant, barely 16, scurried forward with it, hands trembling slightly as he offered the handle. The boy's face had gone pale, sweat beading his upper lip. First dissection, perhaps. He'd grow accustomed. They all did. "The thoracic cavity," Cheselden announced, positioning the saw against my sternum, "houses our most vital organs, heart and lungs, the engines of life. To access them, we must breach the rib cage. Observe the technique. Steady pressure, smooth strokes, allowing the blade's teeth to do the work rather than forcing." The saw bit into bone. I felt the vibration travel through my entire skeleton, a resonance that seemed to shake memory loose from marrow. Each stroke of the blade sang a different note, a terrible music composed of calcium and steel. The sound filled the theater, a rhythmic scraping that made several spectators shift uncomfortably, fans moving faster, one woman pressing a handkerchief scented with lavender to her nose. The bone dust that rose in fine clouds caught the afternoon light like snow, like ash, like the sawdust that used to cover the floor of my carpentry workshop before everything ended. I remembered the smell of fresh-cut pine, the satisfaction of joints fitting perfectly, wood grain revealed by plane and chisel. Now my own grain was being revealed, the inner architecture of Silas Blackwell, displayed for academic consumption. Cheselden completed the sternum cut, then moved to the ribs themselves, using bone shears to crack through cartilage. The sound, sharp snaps one after another, made the young medical student from earlier flinch. His companion, more hardened already, didn't react. The rib cage lifted away like opening a cabinet, hinged at the spine, revealing the glistening organs beneath. A collective intake of breath from the audience. Even those who'd attended dissections before seemed momentarily struck by the intimacy of it, the wet reality of human interior, the organ meat that powered thought and feeling, and all the intangible things we called soul. "Magnificent," Cheselden breathed, and I hated him for the genuine awe in his voice. He wasn't being cruel. He was being scientific. Somehow that was worse. The pericardium, the heart's protective sac, remains intact. You can see the heart itself through the membrane. Note the size. Approximately 12 ounces, slightly enlarged left ventricle consistent with sustained physical labor. Gentlemen, this is a working man's heart. Working man's heart. He was right, of course. My heart had worked every morning at dawn for 25 years since I'd apprenticed with Father. Every night when I'd fallen into bed exhausted, muscles aching, hands cramped. It had worked when I'd carried Anne home from Harrow's townhouse after the assault, her body limp in my arms, her dress torn. It had worked when I'd stayed awake 3 nights straight after her suicide attempt, terrified she'd try again if I slept. It had hammered in my chest when I'd confronted Harrow, when I'd raised the hammer, when I'd brought it down again and again and again. Cheselden made a delicate incision in the pericardium, peeling back the membrane to expose my heart fully. He lifted it slightly with gloved hands. Yes, gloves. He was progressive that way, though he didn't know why cleanliness mattered, wouldn't for another century when Lister proved germ theory, and displayed it to the theater. The organ of emotion, poets claim, he said with a thin smile, the seat of courage and love and all manner of sentiment, in anatomical fact, a pump. 4 chambers, valves to ensure unidirectional flow, muscular walls that contract rhythmically from birth until death. This particular pump functioned for 34 years. It propelled approximately 5 liters of blood through 60,000 miles of blood vessels with each circulation. In this man's lifetime, it beat roughly 1 billion times. 1 billion times. The first flutter I remember. Age 17. Margaret Porter's lips against mine behind the mill on Midsummer Night. She'd tasted like strawberries, and my heart had beat so hard I'd thought she'd feel it through my chest. She'd married someone else 6 months later, a baker's son with better prospects. I'd never blamed her. The last beat I remember, Tyburn gallows, the cart pulling away, rope tightening, panic flooding every vein as my heart thrashed uselessly against the noose's suffocation. Cheselden set my heart on a side table designated for individual organs. It landed with a wet sound, meat on marble, and lay there, still and dark. Around it, he'd eventually place my other organs, arranging them like a market stall displaying goods, lungs here, liver there, intestines coiled in a neat pile. The geography of Silas Blackwell, mapped and labeled and priced at 5 shillings admission. A woman in the front row, Lady Pemberton, if I caught her companion's greeting correctly, swayed in her seat. Her face had gone gray-green, eyes unfocused. When Cheselden reached into my abdominal cavity and began extracting intestines, yards of them glistening and rope-like, she made a small sound and crumpled. 2 attendants rushed forward, carrying her out to scattered applause from those who found her weakness amusing. The digestive tract, Cheselden continued, unbothered by the interruption, measures approximately 25 feet in adults. The small intestine absorbs nutrients. The large intestine processes waste. In this subject's final meal, consumed yesterday evening in Newgate Prison, we can identify partially digested bread and beer. Unremarkable diet for a condemned man, though some request elaborate meals. This one apparently had no appetite. No appetite. How could I eat knowing what awaited? The bread had turned to ash in my mouth, the beer sour. I'd forced down 3 bites to avoid insulting the turnkey who'd brought it. He'd been kind, relatively speaking, during my final days. Told me stories of other condemned men, how they'd faced the rope. Some prayed, some cursed, some laughed. I'd mostly been silent, thinking of Anne. She'd visited that last evening. They'd allowed it. Compassion, perhaps, or cruelty, letting us prolong goodbye. She'd sat across from me in the visiting cell, separated by iron grating, and wept so hard no words emerged for the first 10 minutes. When she finally spoke, "I'm sorry. God, Silas, I'm so sorry. You shouldn't have—" "Stop," I'd interrupted. "You're the only good thing I ever did, Anne. Raising you after Mother died, teaching you letters and numbers, making sure you had a chance. Don't carry this. Harrow did this. The world did this, not you." "But "Not you," I'd repeated firmly. "Promise me, promise you'll live. Find some happiness somewhere. Don't let this be the end for both of us." She'd promised through tears. We both knew she was lying. Some damage can't be outlived. Some sins, hers imagined, mine real, mark bone too deep for healing. Cheselden moved to my liver, extracting the organ with a surgeon's practiced efficiency. It was large and dark, weighing perhaps 3 pounds. He displayed it to the theater, rotating it to show all angles. The liver, he lectured, serves multiple functions, producing bile for digestion, storing glycogen for energy, filtering toxins from blood. This specimen shows early signs of cirrhosis. See the slight nodularity, the firmness, evidence of regular alcohol consumption, though not severe alcoholism. Moderate drinking over years, common in working-class men who frequent public houses. I drank at the Rose and Crown every Friday after receiving wages. 2 pints, sometimes 3. Sitting with other carpenters, complaining about masters who didn't pay, laughing at crude jokes, forgetting for brief hours that Anne and I lived in a single rented room that cost half my income. The beer made evenings bearable. Made me forget that we'd never escape poverty, never own anything, never matter to people like Thomas Harrow except as labor to exploit or bodies to violate. Asterisk. An artist in the 3rd row, Samuel Hook, I'd learn his name later, though later had no meaning for the dead, sketched rapidly, charcoal flying across paper. He captured my open torso with clinical precision, rib cage spread, organs removed or displaced, Cheselden's hands positioned to demonstrate anatomical landmarks. The sketch would appear in Cheselden's next publication, uncredited to me. Just Figure 12, thoracic and abdominal cavity, male subject. My identity erased, my flesh reduced to illustration. The medical students took notes furiously. I watched one, George Hartley, 22, earnest and intelligent, struggle with something internal. His pencil hesitated over paper, lips pressed thin. He was thinking, I realized, actually thinking about me as a person. This was someone, he'd whispered earlier. That thought hadn't left him. It lived in the tension of his shoulders, the pause before he wrote each observation. Remember me, I wanted to tell him. Remember I was Silas. Remember I had reasons. Remember that every fact Cheselden teaches you is also a violation. Knowledge purchased with dignity, advancement bought with degradation. Remember that medicine's progress walks over bodies that never consented, never volunteered, had no choice. But I couldn't speak. Dead men don't lecture. Dead men are lectured about. Cheselden extracted my stomach, slicing it open to display contents. Bread fragments, beer residue, bile. He pointed to specific areas with a probe, explaining digestive processes. The theater's heat intensified. 200 bodies in close quarters, November afternoon sun streaming through windows, the biological warmth of fresh organs releasing their metabolic heat. The smell grew stronger. Blood, viscera, the faint sourness of digestive acids. Some spectators lit pipes, tobacco smoke attempting to mask organic reality. Others breathed through handkerchiefs. The wealthy woman who'd fainted earlier would not return. Her companion, however, stayed, fascination overcoming disgust. The kidneys, Cheselden continued, moving systematically through my abdominal organs. Filter blood, producing urine. This pair appears healthy. No stones, no significant disease. Remarkable, given the subject's class. Poor nutrition often manifests in renal pathology. This man, despite poverty, maintained relatively good health until execution. Good health. My body had been my wealth. Strong back, steady hands, reliable constitution. I'd rarely been sick, couldn't afford to be. No work meant no wages, meant Anne and I went hungry. That health served me well for 34 years, right up until it became property of the state, material for education, entertainment for those who'd paid admission to watch me unmade. By late afternoon, my torso was emptied, organs arranged on side tables like market goods. Cheselden wiped his hands on a cloth, bloodstained, already stiff with drying fluids, and turned his attention upward, to my head, to the seat of everything I'd been. "The skull," he announced, selecting a saw specifically designed for cranial work, "protects our most precious organ, the brain. 3 pounds of matter that contains all thought, all memory, all personality. We now proceed to craniotomy, removal of the skull cap to access cerebral tissue." No, please, not that. Take my heart, my lungs, my guts, but not my brain. Not where Anne lives in memory, where I still remember Mother's face, where the feeling of rain on skin persists, where every moment I've experienced exists somehow in folded gray matter. Not that. But the saw descended anyway, biting into skull just above my eyebrows. The sound was worse than ribs, higher pitched, more penetrating. Bone dust again, finer this time, drifting like pollen. The blade traveled in a careful circle, Cheselden's hand steady from decades of practice. He'd done this to hundreds. I was not special. I was not unique. I was Tuesday afternoon's demonstration, the skull cap lifted away with a wet sucking sound, revealing the dura mater, the tough membrane protecting the brain itself. Cheselden pierced it carefully, peeling back the covering to expose the organ beneath. "Gentlemen," he said softly, something approaching reverence in his voice, "the human brain. Approximately 1,400 cubic centimeters, divided into 2 hemispheres, surface convoluted to increase area. Here resided a murderer's thoughts. Here formed the intention to kill, the rage that drove it, the absence of remorse that condemned him. You're wrong. Remorse lived there too, remorse that it had come to murder, that the world gave me no other option, that Anne's justice required my damnation. Rage, yes, but also love. So much love it became violence when channeled toward her protection. You can't see that in folds of gray tissue. You can't weigh love on your scales or measure it with your probes. Asterisk. Cheselden cradled my brain with both hands, lifting it free from the skull's cavity with the tenderness one might show a newborn. The organ glistened under the theater's light, its surface wrinkled and wet, blood vessels still visible like roadways across gray terrain. He held it up for the audience, rotating it slowly, displaying the frontal lobes, the cerebellum, the brainstem that had once regulated every automatic function keeping me alive. "The architecture of consciousness," he murmured. 3 pounds. Everything I'd ever thought, dreamed, feared, loved, all compressed into 3 pounds of tissue that now sat in a stranger's palms like some grotesque offering. A student in the back row, younger than the others, perhaps 17, whispered to his neighbor, "Where does it go? The person, I mean. If thought lives in tissue, and we hold the tissue, where is he now?" His companion had no answer. Neither did Cheselden, though he pretended otherwise. The soul, young man, is theological concern, not anatomical. We study the vessel, not the passenger. Though some theorists, proponents of phrenology, argue that skull shape and brain structure correlate with criminal tendency. Observe the frontal lobe development here. Within normal parameters, this murderer's brain shows no obvious abnormality. Evil, it seems, requires no special anatomy. Evil. That word again. They'd called me evil at trial. The prosecutor, the judge, the newspapers. Evil carpenter slaughters respected merchant. No mention of what Harrow did. No acknowledgement that Anne's screams went ignored while his wife entertained guests 2 rooms away. Evil was simple to identify when it wore poor man's clothes and wielded a hammer. Evil was complicated when it wore merchant silk and wielded social power. Asterisk. Cheselden placed my brain on the final side table, completing the display. Around the theater, spectators craned to see the full collection: heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, spleen, stomach, intestines, brain, all the component parts of Silas Blackwell, arranged like pieces of a disassembled machine, which, I supposed, is what I'd become. A mechanism explained, mystique dispelled, humanity reduced to hydraulics and tissue mechanics. George Hartley, the earnest student, stared at my brain with something approaching grief. His notes had stopped. pencil rested against paper without marking it. He was seeing through the science to the tragedy beneath, and it was breaking something in him. I wondered if he'd continue his medical studies. I wondered if this moment would haunt him the way it haunted me, though, admittedly, I was doing the haunting. "The dissection of major organs complete," Cheselden announced. "We turn now to detailed anatomical study. The musculature, the vascular system, the nervous pathways. This will occupy us through week's end. The body will be positioned for optimal student access, and I encourage you all to examine the specimen firsthand. Touch, observe, learn. This is your opportunity to understand human construction intimately." Week's end. They'd keep me here, exposed and violated for days. Students would prod my muscles, trace my veins, discuss my anatomy like I was livestock. And after? After, my skeleton would be articulated, bones cleaned, wired together, suspended from a frame in Surgeons Hall's collection, a teaching tool in perpetuity, never buried, never granted the dignity of earth and worms and natural dissolution. Just eternal display, eternal utility, eternal objectification. An attendant wheeled forward a preparation table, and 2 assistants lifted my hollow torso, surprisingly light now, emptied of organs, transferring me to the new position. They arranged my limbs with casual efficiency, adjusting angles for optimal demonstration. One assistant chatted about dinner plans while positioning my left arm. The other hummed a tavern song while spreading my fingers to show tendon structure. This was routine for them. Tuesday's dissection, same as last week's, same as next week's. The murder act guaranteed steady supply. 1 or 2 bodies monthly, more during hanging seasons. They'd never run out. The gallows fed the anatomy theaters, and the anatomy theaters fed medical progress, and medical progress justified the gallows. A perfect circular system, powered by poverty and violence and institutional indifference. An older surgeon, colleague of Cheselden's, Dr. Marcus, approached for closer examination. He lifted my right hand, flexing the fingers, testing joint mobility. "Still some suppleness," he noted. "Rigor hasn't fully set in the extremities. Excellent for demonstrating tendon mechanics." He pulled a scalpel from Cheselden's instrument array and made an incision along my forearm, peeling back skin to reveal the muscle and tendon beneath. "See here," he called to nearby students. "The flexor digitorum profundus controls finger flexion. When we pull this tendon," he inserted forceps, tugged gently, and my fingers curled into a fist. Several students gasped. "The body still obeys mechanical principles even in death. Fascinating, yes?" Those fingers built Anne's bed. Those fingers held a hammer, creating and destroying. Those fingers touched Margaret's face in the moment before our first kiss, trembling with nervous excitement. Those fingers closed around the hammer handle when I confronted Harrow, knuckles white with rage and grief. Now their demonstration material, pulled by forceps, flexing on command like a puppet's gesture. The afternoon light shifted, sun declining toward evening. Gas lamps were lit around the theater's perimeter, flames casting dancing shadows that made my emptied torso seem to move, seem to breathe. An illusion, nothing more. But several spectators shifted uncomfortably, the shadows reminding them that this display had, hours earlier, been animate, had walked and talked and felt. Lady Pemberton's companion, Lady Sarah Thornhill, finally departed, her fascination exhausted or her conscience awakened. As she passed through the theater doors, I heard her whisper to her footman, "Ghastly business, necessary, I suppose, for medical advancement, but ghastly." She'd return to her townhouse, dine on roasted pheasant, discuss the dissection over wine as scandalous entertainment. By week's end, she'd have forgotten my name, if she'd learned it at all. The artist, Samuel Hook, continued sketching. His portfolio now contained a dozen images, my unopened body, the Y-incision progression, organs displayed individually, the craniotomy sequence, the brain extraction. These would be published, distributed to medical schools across Europe, studied by surgeons in Edinburgh and Paris and Vienna. My anatomy would become textbook material, my flesh transformed into education that would save lives I'd never meet, in places I'd never see. Is that redemption? Knowledge purchased with violation, progress built on degradation. If my dissection teaches a surgeon to repair a child's damaged heart, does that justify this? If understanding my muscle structure helps a doctor restore a laborer's injured hand, does that balance the scales? I don't know. The math of morality becomes complicated when you're the currency being spent. Asterisk. By 6 o'clock, the theater began emptying. Students departed, clutching notes, discussing what they'd learned. Wealthy spectators filed out, already planning next week's attendance. Doctor shook Cheselden's hand, congratulating him on an excellent demonstration. The assistants began cleaning instruments, washing blood from scalpels and saws. Only George Hartley remained, staring at my remains. Cheselden noticed, approached with curiosity. "Still here, Mr. Hartley?" The demonstration concluded. "Sir, Hartley struggled for words. "Did you know his name? Before today, I mean. Did you know who he was?" Cheselden's expression reflected genuine confusion at the question's relevance. Silas Blackwell, carpenter, condemned for murder. These facts were provided in the execution report. Why do you ask? Because he's not just a specimen. He was a person this morning. He had a sister. I heard him mention her at the gallows. He had reasons. And now he's this. How do we learn from bodies without forgetting they were people? Something flickered across Cheselden's face, not regret, but perhaps a distant echo of the same question, encountered long ago and deliberately buried. Then it passed, shuttered behind the surgeon's clinical mask. "We serve a higher purpose, Mr. Hartley. Medical knowledge, the advancement of healing. Yes, this man was a person. He was also a murderer who forfeited his rights. His death served society twice, once as punishment, once as education. We honor him by learning well. Now go home. Process what you've seen." Hartley left, shoulders slumped, looking older than his years. The theater emptied. Attendants extinguished most lamps, leaving only 2 burning near my body. The night watchman would patrol periodically, ensuring no resurrection men stole specimens. In the silence, I became aware of time's passage differently. No heartbeat to measure seconds, no breath to mark moments, just consciousness suspended in eternal present, the cold marble beneath me, the gas lamps hiss, London's distant sounds, carriages on cobblestone, church bells marking 7. Anne would be in our room now, alone with knowledge of what had happened today. The guilt would consume her, irrational guilt that none of this was her fault. Would she eat? Would she sleep? Would she keep her promise to live? No, I knew her too well. This would break her, slowly but completely. 2 victims then. Harrow destroyed us both, but the law only punished one. Tomorrow, Cheselden would return with students. They'd examine my musculature, trace tendons, document nerve pathways. By week's end, my bones would be cleaned, bleached, then articulated. Wired together, suspended from a frame, mounted in Surgeons Hall's collection. There I would hang for decades, an anonymous skeleton labeled male age 34, executed 1752. Students would study me, touch my bones, measure my femur. None would know my name. None would know about Anne, about my father teaching me carpentry, about the bed I'd built. Forever specimen, forever educational, forever denied Earth's embrace, worms' consumption, natural dissolution. Medical progress would march over my bones, literally, and call it advancement. The lamps guttered. The watchman passed. Somewhere, Anne lay awake. Somewhere, Harrow's widow tucked his children into bed. Somewhere, justice and injustice swirled together like blood in water. And here, on cold marble, Silas Blackwell, carpenter, brother, murderer, man, became history, became specimen, became everything except what he'd been. Himself. The murder act would remain until 1832. Thousands of bodies, thousands of Silases, dissected and denied burial. Names forgotten, reasons unexamined, humanity dismissed beside anatomical utility. George Hartley would remember me. But one person's memory couldn't restore dignity, couldn't undo display, couldn't grant burial. I remained. Consciousness or imagination, afterlife or dream, I experienced it as real. Tuesday's anatomy lesson, Specimen 47, November 1752, the carpenter who attended his own funeral and couldn't leave when it ended. The lamps died. Darkness claimed the theater. And in that darkness, I waited for dawn and the students who would return to continue their study.